that's no problem. Okay, if everyone could take a seat, we'll get started. There's lots of seats up front. People never like to take them, but they are here. All right. Good morning. My name is Cynthia Arnson. I'm the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. And on behalf of the Latin American program and my colleague Eric Olson in the Mexico Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to this session today on organized crime in Central America. Eric is not able to be here and to chair this panel as a result of a family emergency, but his hand in pulling together the work and working with each of our researchers has been tremendous. Over the past several months, the Latin American program and the Mexico Institute have been engaged in a wide-ranging discussion with researchers and policymakers in the United States and in Latin America over how to deepen the understanding of organized crime in the region and its disastrous effects on democratic governance, human rights, economic development, and obviously personal security. For the Mexico Institute, it's been obvious that this inquiry has been driven by the explosion of narco-trafficking and drug-related violence in Mexico, U.S. media attention to this phenomenon, and the implications of organized crime for the rule of law, for public safety, democratic institutions, and questions of governance. If you have not been able to grab a copy of this book outside or download it from the web, I highly recommend. This is a premier volume talking about organized crime in Mexico, the relationship to the United States, and the impact on bilateral relations, and it includes an excellent chapter on Central America written by Steve Dudley. During a congressional trip to El Salvador and Guatemala last spring, we were able to hear directly from government officials in those two countries about how organized crime and the crackdown on the cartels in Mexico are having profound effects that are felt in the Central American region. Officials from the U.S. Embassy, from the Salvadoran government, the Guatemalan government, the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala, members of the United Nations, Cicig, the Commission to Investigate Impunity, researchers, members of civil society across the board spoke about the accelerating impact of Mexico's crackdown on drug cartels on the spreading of narcotics-related activity and violence throughout Central America. We will be hearing from Chris Ashe, who works for the Central America Regional Security Initiative from the State Department, which is extending the attention paid by the U.S. government under the Merida Initiative to the smaller countries of Central America to engage in anti-narcotics assistance. The earlier work here in this document published by Steve Dudley has indicated that about 90% of illegal drugs coming into the United States pass through Mexico and Central America. About half of that goes through Central America itself. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras have been the most acutely affected. Not surprisingly, these are also three countries that have had tremendous problems predating the upsurge in organized crime having to do with transnational gang activity. I'd like to introduce briefly our various speakers. What we're trying to do at this stage of the work is increase the specific knowledge of the dynamics of organized crime in particular countries. We are attempting to sort of overcome the stovepiping that exists as we study this. In the 1990s, we looked at Colombia-United States relations in terms of narco activity. Now we're looking at Mexico-U.S., and I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind the sub-regional dynamics involving the Andes, Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and of course elsewhere in South America. So that's, I think, part of what we're attempting to do, but we also have realized that we need to know a lot more about the particular dynamics of organized crime in the countries of Central America where we know that it's having an increased impact. This event is being webcast. We would invite all of you during your questions and comments to introduce yourself and to wait for the microphone. And even though you have the speakers' biographies in front of you, I'll, for the purposes of the virtual audience, say a few words. We'll start out with Doug Farah, a longtime friend and colleague who I first met in El Salvador during the years that he was the Washington Post correspondent in that country, covering the war. He is a fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center and president of IBI Consultants. He regularly briefs the U.S. military, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice on issues related to organized crime and terrorism. And I can say with certainty from his years as a journalist in Central America that he has developed an incredible ability to penetrate clandestine groups and to find out about them and to write about them. His work on the death squads in El Salvador is some of the best material to this day. Following Doug, we'll hear from James Bosworth, who is a freelance writer and consultant based in Managua, Nicaragua. He has written reports on Latin American security, on the radicalization and recruitment efforts by Al-Qaeda online, and also has written about cybersecurity issues and the attempts to combat the Conficker botnet. He publishes a daily blog called Bloggings by Boz, and I'm sure many of you, after you hear his presentation, will be delighted to sign up and learn more, and has studied Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy. Julie Lopez is a freelance journalist based in Guatemala, where she reports on politics and on security issues. Her work has been published widely in the Harvard Review of Latin America, the Miami Herald, and she has also published with the BCC English and Spanish editions from the region. Just this past May, she won the Felix Varela National Award for Excellence in American Journalism on Latino issues. I'll stop there and then introduce Juan Carlos Garzón from the OAS, who has just joined us, and Chris when we turn to the comments. Doug, the floor is open. It's on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cindy, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for having this event and allowing us to do this research, because I think it's really important to look not just at Mexico, but the repercussions further south. And the more one spends looking at these issues, the more clear it is that it's not a Mexican problem. It's a problem that encompasses the entire region and beyond, but certainly Central America, because of its lack of institutional capabilities, is coming out of conflict, and in this geography make it particularly vulnerable to the drug trafficking phenomenon and the impact that has on this. One of the things I focused on in the paper, and what I'd like to focus on a little bit here, is what I found striking in doing this research was that we're dealing with networks that were established many years ago, going back to the era during the Cold War and the conflicts in Central America, which I covered up close and personal for the latter half of the 1980s, primarily in El Salvador, but also in Nicaragua and Honduras. And what's really sort of came into focus for me in doing this work was that you have networks that were established to do particular things during those wars that simply shifted over in many cases and became criminal enterprises in the very shortly after the peace process kicked in. And I think that this is one of the explanations. I get asked often, why is Central America, particularly El Salvador, why do you have these sort of full-fledged organized criminal groups growing up seemingly out of nothing? It's almost like the immaculate conception of these groups. They didn't go through a lot of the process that other groups go through, where they have the little crime and the big crime, and you sort of over a period of years accumulate, as the Colombians did, accumulate an experience in this. And I think the answer, in part, is that you're simply dealing with people who knew what they were doing for many years and simply stopped doing it for political reasons and entered into the organized crime realm rather quickly. And one of the things that I found in my years ago, and I actually wrote a series in 1997 for the Washington Post on the gangs in El Salvador, and one of the things that surprised me, I went in with a photographer who had gotten to know them quite well and got me permission to go in. So I finally go into this major gang group, and and they present me to the command, the guy leading the gang. He looks at me and says, "Douglas?" And I said, "Sí." And he said, "No me reconoces." And you don't know me. I said, "No." He said he was one of the FMLN Special Forces guys I had known during the war. And then he introduced me to his second in command, who was an Atlacat-trained U.S. military Special Forces guy. And between them, at the inception of those gangs, And I think it's one of the things that we often don't understand in the gangs, because we look at sort of the street level operations. These guys were already planning and had the weapons to really destroy the police force in that particular moment, because they had access to automatic weapons. AK-47s were highly trained, whereas the police were coming in newly trained out of different armed groups, but the FMLN or the old security forces and the new recruits. It was very difficult for them to adapt with 38 revolvers going into neighborhoods, to adapt to gangs that were already structured militarily for territorial control. And at that point, when I was dealing with them, they were dealing primarily in stolen cars, weapons trafficking, and already exchanging on a small level cocaine for different activities. They had a sort of a price list. There was an agreed-upon exchange rate for what a kilo of coke would buy them in terms of weapons, cars, illegals passing through. And so looking back on the history of it, it's not that surprising that these groups, and I think that, in the way I look at it, in most of the peace processes, particularly El Salvador and Nicaragua, 95, 98, 99% of the people who demobilized and went into the process did so in good faith, and you have a much broader political representation in those countries than you had during the war and the conflict and the peaces that led to the war. But particularly in El Salvador, you have remnants on both the extreme right and extreme left that never demobilized. And I think that those are the ones that created, during the war, specific networks for the movement of weapons, for the movement of people, for the falsification of documents, and at the same time they created a broad international alliance. On the left you had the FMLN, of course, going to Cuba, but then a very broad European network, relationships down clearly with the Sandinistas, very, very tightly into the FARC in Nicaragua, and in Colombia and elsewhere. And on the right you had primarily the Guatemala link, and then into Miami in the United States. And on both sides, as I said, most of these people, most of the groups demobilized, came into the process and gave up the armed conflict. And those that didn't, and if in the paper I talk about it, immediately after, not immediately after, almost immediately after the peace processes were signed in El Salvador, there's a very alarming kidnapping. A group kidnapped the son of President Cristiani's best friend. They kidnapped Saul Suster's son. And I was still working as a reporter at the time. We spent a lot of time on this, and we were all initially convinced that it was the far right punishing Cristiani for having signed the peace accords. That seemed like the logical thing, and the far right had a history of kidnapping. And it turned out in the end that it was, in fact, groups of the far right that were doing that. But for the first time that I was aware of, they had franchised out the operation to a remnant of the Communist Party that was able, that had not demobilized with the rest of the FMLN, and had carried out the kidnapping for money, and then went on to carry out a series of kidnappings in Brazil and elsewhere. They found they were quite good at this, and they just sort of kept going. And it's that sort of network. Why? Because if you remember in 1992 as well in Nicaragua, there was the explosion of that underground bunker that was quite famous at the time. It was an ETA garage run by the Basque group. On top of it and underneath there was this large arsenal. And for a while, as a journalist, you could go to the judge's office and pick through all the piles of paper. Who was in there? Every major terrorist organization in the world, and including, that was the first time we came across Lori Berenstain, who was then arrested in Peru's Tupac Amaru. She had been with the FMLN previously. All of her documents, all the documents of all the FMLN leaderships, thousands of blank passports, legitimate Nicaraguan passports, everything you need to run a clandestine operation. And if that was 1992, after supposedly the disarmament had taken place, and clearly it hadn't. So the point being that all of these groups have ways of moving things, and they simply turned into cocaine and other products instead of using it for their political ends. When they needed to sneak people across from Honduras into El Salvador during the war, when the FMLN was doing that, they used what they called the Ruta del Queso. It was this old cheese smuggling route. They liked Honduran cheese, and they would bring it across the border without paying taxes. And that's one of the trickle-down cocaine routes now. It goes to exactly the same place, exactly the same border crossings, etc. And so I think that that's one of the sort of the main things that struck me, was that you're dealing with deeply entrenched groups. In my conception, I think that most of us who dealt with the peace processes up close and personal was that if you got rid of the armed groups, you had solved the problem. And I think that was one of our great sort of shortcomings, and something to keep in mind in future conflicts, that unless you get at the networks that provide the clandestine services to the different sides in the war, you're going to end up with a large organized crime problem, as you've seen in Bosnia and other places where I've worked as well. And so I think that's one of the big takeaways for me in this research. The other thing that's striking in El Salvador is the Mexicanization of the Salvadoran organizations. If you look particularly, there's one of the main groups that's tied to the traditional political structure, Los Perrones Orientales, who run a lot of the cocaine, the transit routes across from the Pacific coast and up to Guatemala. Is that they as we saw, I also covered the Colombian experience very closely, and you saw the adoption of certain things that were Colombian in other parts of the world. And now these guys do the corridas. They brought in a bunch of race horses. They built race tracks. They raced Ferraris out in San Miguel. All of these things, and they've assumed sort of this Mexican persona as opposed to the Colombian persona that was sort of on the periphery before. But it's clearly the Mexican organizations have pushed deep in, and they've become the model for these groups to now follow, which is kind of striking on a cultural level. They view themselves as very akin to the Mexican organizations. And what seems to be the case, and unfortunately I've had my own family emergency I was dealing with the last few days, so I haven't had a chance to read my colleagues' papers. It'll be interesting to see if they found the same thing. What you see is the push in of the Sinaloa and the Zetas seem to be the two main operating groups on a broader scale, whereas a little further south, particularly in Ecuador, dealing with the FARC in some ways, it seems to be Tijuana. The Tijuana organization, fragmented though it is in weeks, seems to have reach down into the Ecuador side. And so but the way it seems to work in El Salvador, and I spend a lot of time talking to people in the business and who monitor the business very closely, is that the Mexicans aren't that interested in establishing a huge presence there. They're not there for control. They have enough control through Los Perrones, through the other groups, that they're able to do what they need to do without establishing a massive presence there. I think it's a little different in Guatemala, maybe, where the Zetas have actually territorial control. Here, what they're doing is making sure that it's mostly, the passing through of the illicit product is either cocaine or illegal immigrants or weapons and stolen cars and weapons coming and money coming from the north to the south, and going north is the different products you can plug into the transnational criminal pipeline. Essentially, my conception of it is, if you look at it as a pipeline, there are different nodes where you can pop stuff into the pipeline, whether it's 300 AK-47s, 40 Chinese, or 50 kilos of cocaine, and you can be pretty sure that product, with a better record than FedEx probably, will deliver that product where you want it to be on the other side of the border. It's just they go through the same gatekeepers for whatever product you're moving, which has allowed these groups to become much more multifaceted in their criminal operations. They don't have to stick to one thing because they can do the other. And the other thing that's really striking, and you certainly see it in Ciudad Juarez, where I was on another Woodrow Wilson Center project, is the narcomenudeo was one of the driving factors in the local violence that you see there, the street sales. Because when you have, and I think if you look at the hierarchy of the gangs, there's been some pretty good literature on this fairly recently. The third and fourth generation gangs, I think, are what we're looking at, where the upper layer is this highly structured military unit that provides security and has direct relationships with transnational criminal organizations, and then down through to the street level guys who are the 13, 14, 15-year-old kids recruited in schools, where you see a lot of the violence on the street that affects day-to-day life. And a lot of that is driven by the need of those groups to control specific street corners for the specific sale of cocaine. And one of the things that's striking, and I think you'll see it also if you look to West Africa and elsewhere, is that the cartels will almost inevitably begin paying in product instead of dollars, which creates the need to create an internal market to sell it. Because if you're a Mara Salvatrucha guy holding a kilo of cocaine, it doesn't do you any good unless you turn that into cash, right? So you fight for the corners and the vending places where you can make the money, where you can turn that cocaine into cash, and that's where you get these horrendous street fights, running battles and the territorial lines being drawn and redrawn as these groups move forward and try very hard to convert their product into cash, much lower rate than they would get in the United States and elsewhere, but for them significantly more than they've ever had before. And I think if you look at the gangs, the upper level gang of Marisol de Tucha particularly has a truly transnational reach. It has, franchises in 150, 170 cities in the United States. They're on the Mexican border working with the cartels, providing muscle in the transnational movement. And they reach deeply into Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and have sort of the network of people to give orders, to carry out orders, to provide protection. But that's a relatively small chunk of the gangs. In fact, a very small chunk at the upper level. As you go down, you get into the different sort of neighborhood structures, more localized structures down to the narco-menudeo level. And that's where, in one way, it's the most difficult to combat, because you are really dealing with 15, 16, 17-year-old kids that most societies don't want to lock up for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, they're carrying out a horrendous amount of killing. You had in El Salvador the burning of the buses with people inside in August, where including some small children, and they set the bus on, poured gasoline, locked the doors, and set it on fire. A pretty horrendous undertaking for a group in internal violence where there's no declared internal conflict. And the other thing that's really striking is the level, and having lived very closely through the Salvador process and had a lot invested emotionally in the 10 years I spent there, watching the impact that the drug trafficking has on the democratic institutions, I think, is one of the other most profoundly disturbing aspects. I mean, here countries come out of a war with a chance to remake society, and in many ways they did. Particularly in El Salvador and Nicaragua, you have radically transformed political dynamics, which are now being essentially run to the ground by drug trafficking money that comes in the violence, because the states simply cannot cope with them. And if they could, they may not, because the level of political corruption. We look at the Perrones and some of the other groups in El Salvador in the paper. They've gone. The cartels have very quickly identified the political leadership, began putting money into the political system. What you see now in El Salvador for the first time is money coming in at very low levels. They're putting money into races in the alcaldías and the municipios. Instead of worrying about the national level, they're worried about specific, and this is the other thing I think it's difficult to drive a policy to deal with it. But most of the corruption, if you look at it, is specifically geographically oriented to facilitate specific transiting routes. It's not widespread, massive corruption everywhere necessarily. They look at where they need to be and how to get their product. The Carrera Litoral, the Carrera Panamericana, Acajutla, the crossings into Guatemala are specific points of interest, which is why in some cases parties that should have disappeared because they have less votes than their fingers don't disappear, because in specific locations there's still the political power. For the PDC being one example, the PCN another example of parties that have less than the 5% that they need. It used to be that they needed 5% to survive. When they didn't get the 5%, but it was viewed as necessary to having them survive, they lowered it to 3% of the popular vote. They had to maintain themselves as parties, and a lot of that I think can be traced to the influence of drug traffickers wanting specific people in specific places geographically to survive, because those are routes that they need in control. And in that little town, in that little city, that's still the power, even though nationally they're virtually non-existent anymore. Okay, I'm about done here. So I think those are the main takeaways. But I think that it's really disturbing, because we're not looking south nearly enough, I would say, in our policy. I worked on the Mexico book that Cindy showed you, which I think really is a fantastic compilation of really interesting, forward-looking things. But the amount we're putting further south is minuscule compared to the challenge, and it's certainly better than nothing. And I think there are a lot of creative ways to leverage the ability, our resources, and multiply them. And it's, as everyone knows who's worked on failed and failing states and sort of weak states, the number of things you have to do simultaneously to make a significant difference are very, very difficult to coordinate. And I think the Colombians, maybe more than anyone, have come up with a fairly good, for their region, I think it has to be adapted, obviously, but they've actually come up with a methodology of what happens when as the state seeks to retake controls in areas of violence. And I think, but it's very difficult to do. It's costly and it's very time consuming. And we no longer have much money and we don't have much patience. And I think as we look south, if we don't begin dealing with this, Mexico is not going to get better. And Mexico has a huge back door that's open, and they're fighting for their lives in other parts of the country, and on the northern border where we're pressuring them, the South has become the escape valve. And finally, I'll finish with this on the money laundering issues. That if you look, one of the huge consequences, one of the huge things that facilitated the narcos' ability to move into Central America is the dollarization of the Salvadoran economy and the dollarization of the Ecuadorian economy, which is coupled with Panama. So you now have 3 dollarized economies where the money can flow from the United States through different value exchange mechanisms, through within alliance with Russian organized crime, any number of ways. They can get their dollars to Central America, where the cartels can simply withdraw it and move it north much more easily than they can move it south from the United States down in. And it causes huge economic distortions in El Salvador. If you look at the number of banks and if you even accounting for a growth in remittances, which I don't think is actually happening, because I think during this recession we've seen actually a diminishing of remittances back there. There's a huge gap of unexplained dollars flowing into El Salvador. And if you look at the fictitious economic life of San Salvador and the malls, or San Miguel and the malls, it's clear that 99% of the people in El Salvador cannot be there. 99% of the stores don't sell very much, not 99%, but a significant percentage of the stores don't sell very much. And yet that is the laundering machine for vast amounts of money that's flowing south, partly because it's so easy to do because of dollarization. Dollarization was viewed as, I'm not saying that it wasn't a necessary thing in the macroeconomic, it made sense perhaps at the time. I don't really know, but the result has been this huge extension of money laundering possibilities to Mexicans and U.S. and Colombian organizations that they didn't have a few years ago. And I'll stop there.
Boss.
All right, thanks. Thanks to the Wilson Center. This is a fantastic opportunity, and like Doug, I feel that it's a somewhat understudied issue, and it does need to be focused on a bit more, because as pressure is put on in Colombia, these groups have gone to Mexico, and as pressure is put on in Mexico, these groups are moving further south and extending their reach further south, and causing havoc in many ways. My paper's on Honduras, but obviously the elephant in the room in Honduras is the 2009 coup. You can't start. It's fascinating to look at organized crime individually, and then you have this giant coup that occurs, and nobody in June of 2009 was asking themselves, "Hey, I wonder what Chapo thinks about this." But there's a sense that the Mexican cartels and transnational criminal organizations in general really benefited from the political situation in 2009. And as I did this paper, that was the one single conclusion that seemed to resonate throughout all of my interviews. One official told me, he said, look, organized crime was getting worse during Zelaya, and it skyrocketed under the Micheletti. And at this point under Lobo, it's maybe plateaued. Situations may be getting a little better because of everything going on. But really, when your entire political process is focused on the coup and on political battles, it really lost focus on crime. It's not as if the situation was particularly good prior to the coup. The Honduras was already sitting at about 60 murders per 100,000. Which it places it at one of the highest levels in the world, if not. And in 2010, it may be the highest level in the world. These statistics aren't perfect, but at 65 to 70 per 100,000, it's going to be one of the highest murder rates in the world. And in 2010, you've seen 7 or 8 journalists already killed. There are significant pressures against human rights situations. All of these issues stem from the coup, and many of these issues benefited the transnational criminal organizations. As Doug mentioned, one of the things you've seen in Central America is the Mexicanization of the process over the last decade. You have flights, to go through the process briefly, you have cocaine being produced in South America, Peru, Colombia, a lot of Colombia, and the flights are leaving from Colombia or from Venezuela these days and flying into mostly Honduras. Honduras has become the big runway for Central America in terms of flights. They assume there are anywhere upwards of 150 flights that took place in 2009, and that is the flights that they think they can track. There are some people who believe that post-coup there was a flight a day with cocaine. That was the highest level of estimates I saw. There is... So they can go by flights, they can go by sea. Boats go fast, semi-submersibles. They have fishing vessels that tow semi-submersibles, taking them up the coast. And the flights to Honduras, or the sea vessels going to Honduras, are controlled mostly by either Colombian organizations, increasingly a bit of Venezuelan native cartels, which are starting to increase, or micro cartels. And actually, there are some small micro cartels throughout Central America. We like to focus on Sinaloa, the Zetas, MS-13, because they're big organizations. We can identify a leadership structure, but there's a pretty significant amount of cocaine moving through micro cartels. These groups are often family-run, same family, one or two families, anywhere between, some people say as small as 2, but legitimately 10 to 25 individuals. Who control a certain section and will move cocaine up past one border and through a certain country. Oftentimes up the sea. They do this by boat. Oftentimes up the sea. There's one on the Costa Rica Nicaragua border that's moving cocaine up, and there's one on the Nicaraguan Honduras border made up of Hondurans, about 25 of them, that is moving it across the border there. Once it gets to Honduras, the point of Honduras in this process is where the process Mexicanizes. And really Sinaloa and the Zetas are the big two. The Gulf Cartel today does have a presence, but the presence is minimal, and really the Gulf Cartel is picking up the cocaine in Costa Rica or Nicaragua and just kind of driving it through Honduras up to Guatemala or Mexico. They're not really stopping in Honduras. So it's Sinaloa and the Zetas, and they take control at this point in Honduras. They from either the micro cartels or the Colombian organizations. And from there, they move it out either by land or by sea. There aren't very many flights leaving Honduras. That did change a bit for a brief period in 2009. But usually the flights land in Honduras. A lot of times they crash land the plane, destroy the evidence. They usually only use the plane once. Actually, one of the indicators that one of the Attorney General officials told me in Honduras, he said that one of the ways we knew this was bad was that they were actually leaving with the flights in Honduras in 2009. They're actually not crash landing them. They were landing them on airstrips, turning around and making multiple runs, which they said they usually can't do. So they land there, and then they transfer it to the Mexican organizations, and they move it either by land into Guatemala or by sea into Guatemala or Mexico. Generally, Sinaloa prefers land, Zetas prefer sea, but that's not a perfect plan. There's not a easy map that you can draw of Honduras in terms of Sinaloa is here, Zetas are here, Gulf is here, the gang organizations are here. It's really a much broader mixed match, and they're not having the same territorial control wars that you see maybe in Mexico. Instead, the violence is a lot of localized violence. Doug noted that there's local drug distribution, and actually, when I spoke with Honduran officials, they said local drug consumption, local drug trafficking, is really a key concern. The gangs, which are not. Most people do not believe are part of the transnational process in terms of actually picking up cocaine and moving it from across one border to another. But the gangs are involved in a lot of the local drug sales. So marijuana, the gangs actually have a huge problem with huffing paint and with prescription drugs. And they control certain neighborhoods in San Pedro Sula, Tegucigalpa. And then the gangs also, when they, in their free time, go out and work for the Mexican organizations as muscle. And muscle is really the right term for that. Several people told me that the Mexican cartels do not believe that the gangs are smart enough to manage the transnational criminal organization. I don't know if that's it. And their indication was they're willing to hire these people to go out and work runways and to provide security for cocaine that's moving inside of Honduras, but the Mexican cartels do not trust the gangs to actually move it, and so they just kind of freelance them out to run certain issues. So in 2009, what happens? So across 2008, early 2009, the Zelaya administration is really not focused on the security issue. They're focused on potential constitutional reform, economic issues. The security issue was off the agenda for Zelaya. Zelaya was elected on a platform that he was going to be a little bit softer than Maduro, who was the president before him, and he was going to work to rehabilitate gang members. He was going to work to possibly negotiate and try a softer approach than the mano dura that Maduro did. And when Zelaya took office, he dropped the ball. I don't mean that too meanly, because he was focused on other issues. I mean, there are a set of priorities in Honduras, and so around 2008, he decides to pick it up again and go after the gangs. But really, the focus never really got to security. And if you look at the murder rates in Honduras across 2007, 2008, early 2009, it's on an upward trend. The coup happens, and if Zelaya wasn't focused on security, and he was some criticism that he was using the military for political purposes, including working the election issue. Micheletti certainly was not focused on security. His security people would tell you they didn't have a strategy for dealing with organized crime. His security people were actually pretty blunt. They had zero control over the airspace. Micheletti was using the military to repress protesters, to monitor the border at one point to prevent Zelaya from entering or prevent Zelaya's supporters from entering. The military and police and local authorities were being used in other ways. So, but here comes the critical issue here for me as I study this. The international community, because of democracy issues, cut off a lot of aid to Honduras and cut off a lot of communication with Honduras. And we have a set of competing priorities here. If you read any paper on organized crime, on drug trafficking in this hemisphere, they tell you that countries cooperating, countries communicating is the key to preventing organized crime, to preventing drug trafficking. A comprehensive strategy is necessary. And yet when it comes to democracy promotion, when a government gets overthrown in a coup, it's all about sanctions and cutting off diplomacy. And from that front, there are second-order consequences to what we do with a lot of these policies. And my goal isn't to re-argue the coup or re-argue the response to the coup, but we do need to recognize that there are these second-order consequences. And one of those consequences was we cut off information sharing with the Hondurans. The U.S. government did, the region did. And when they cut off that information sharing, they were unable to track movements across borders of transnational criminals. They were unable to prosecute gang members who were killing in one country and then moving across to the other. When the U.S. cut off assistance to the Honduran Attorney General's office, the Honduran Attorney General's office said it was our limited resources, and their budgets were cut throughout this process because of various international sanctions against an unlimited financed organized crime. I mean, that really has more money than the Hondurans ever could hope to have on their own. And so these second-order consequences really built up, and the cartels moved in. I mean, whether it was a strategy session and they held a meeting and they said, geez, we're going to go into Honduras these 6 months, it's going to be fantastic, or if it's just an evolutionary process in which they find the path of least resistance, and this turned out to be the path of least resistance. Flights went up, cocaine went up. They estimate anywhere between 500 tons and 1,000 tons went through in 2009. And a similar amount is going to go through in 2010. They were able to consolidate control in a lot of areas. So elections happen, local government is in. It's controversial. There was a great session yesterday on what the situation is there. The local government has, at the very least, managed to reopen information sharing with its neighbors, which is really key. The Honduran Minister of Security at one point said that they were unable to track Mexican cartel movements in Honduras during 2009 because of the coup. They are now able to reopen communications. The local government, though, may not be helping itself in certain areas. There's a conflict still between democracy and security in certain areas. Just in this last week, the local government decided they were going to go up to Copan. There was a legislator killed there a couple weeks ago. They were going to go up to Capan, crack down on the transnational criminal organizations, most of which are Sinaloa in that area. And they were going to roll in, and at the same time, they made the same week they made the announcement they were going to go into Bajo Aguan, where there is, further east from Copan, where there is a landless farmers movement. And they claim the landless farmers movement is armed and trying to start a revolution that they're funded by illicit trafficking. And the local government's providing mixed messages. There is a serious security problem in Honduras. There are armed groups in Honduras in terms of organized criminal organizations that are causing mass havoc. And there are legitimate social movements in Honduras that that there may be a small sector of which is armed, but overall they are nonviolent and they are not cartel backed. They really do have a strong economic presence and issue, and the local government is not doing a good job explaining itself, differentiating between some of these issues that are as they occur. And so what it creates is a backlash against them in terms of there are a lot of people within the Resistencia, there are a lot of people internationally who see what they're doing and think it's all a fraud. They see them cracking down on people who are legitimate social movements, and and there are people, and at the same time, it degrades their own ability to fight organized crime, and I think that's a shame, because at 64 murders per 100,000 or whatever it may be at this year, it's going to be a particularly bad security situation, and it's one that they do need to focus on. And with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you.
I just need assistance to operate.
Okay. Let's see. Nikki, thanks. Gives me an opportunity to thank Nikki Nichols, Adam Drolet, Adam Stubbits, Jose Raul Perales of the Latin American Program staff that have been working very hard to bring this about.
Well, I would like to raise a few issues regarding Guatemala and the problem it's facing with organized crime. Right now, Guatemala seems to be in a situation where it's involved in two kinds of wars. One, on the one hand, it's at war with organized crime. On the other hand, it's at war with itself, mostly because it's confronting several problems that have to deal with corruption and with impunity. And these problems have roots in the civil conflict, in the armed conflict that lasted 36 years. However, I'm going to try and give you an executive version of the situation. And for instance, I'd like to start with the nature of organized crime, how it's understood in Guatemala. For instance, organized crime, it's seen as a combination of foreign organized crime networks, local organizations, and also local authorities. At different times in history, these authorities have been either military or civilian, have been mayors, have held different positions. There's a tendency to think that it's only the military, it's only the police, but there's also a high degree of involvement of civilian authorities at different levels. For instance, there's something to be considered. Starting in the 1960s, there was complete military control over the territory. So any criminal activity on a large scale had to be known by the military. It was impossible, and analysts concede in this, it was impossible for any large-scale criminal operation to be carried out without the military knowing about it. In the 1980s, when the conflict was at its worst stage, there was one of the problems that the army had was that because of the injuries the army sustained and the dead, they had to train and speed the process of training of troops. So in this process, some quality control was lost, and they weren't fully vetting some of the military officials that were in key positions. They were overlooking some let's say, unorthodox situations in which some of the military officials in certain areas were showing signs of life quality improvement that weren't fully investigated. And so this element by itself had something to do with the corruption starting to grow in the different military ranks. Then also in the 1980s, we have the first civilian free elections in 1985, at the end of 1985, while the civil conflict was still going on. I mentioned this because, at least in the case of Guatemala, the peace process was somewhat unusual compared to other countries in the sense that there were free elections before the peace accords were signed. This was in 1985. Then there were 2 more elections before the peace process or the peace accords were finally signed. Some view this as an opportunity that the army took between 1985 and 1996 to consolidate their position in state structures, even though the government was run by civilians. Also, another perspective of this is that the army allowed elections to occur in 1985 because they thought they had already destroyed or defeated the guerrilla in the civil conflict. So they allowed the elections to progress and a civilian government to take office. In the 1990s, the peace accords led to the military to withdraw from key positions in the country, positions they had controlled since the 60s. However, for example, in the 80s, especially like in the early 80s, the first drug trafficking incursions from Colombians were detected by the military, and they were detected because they had control over the whole territory. These first incursions, at first they started to or tried to bombard cocaine in different areas in the country, hoping that the local farmers or locals would engage in trafficking the cocaine. When this didn't work, they started doing intelligence work, seeing which farmers, for instance, had a bad year with their harvest and which farmers had landing strips in their property. So they started renting these landing strips to land their planes. Some of the farmers didn't accept. Others pretended that they didn't know what the landing strips were going to be used for, and began renting them. There aren't official numbers on how many landing strips were being rented, but one analyst says that in the early 80s there were at least 100. Perhaps there were more, but there were at least 100. Also, eventually, it's from the mid-80s, more or less, early mid-80s. Some of these, the price that the drug traffickers were paying local farmers to use their property or the landing strips was about $50,000 per year. However, in some cases, or a few years down the line, they started paying the farmers not only in money, in dollars, but also in drugs. So the payment of drug distribution or transportation in product or in drugs, not only in money, at least in the case of Guatemala, dates back from the early 80s. While this was going on in the 90s, then we move on to the 90s. By then, drug traffickers had already been acquiring property, and sometimes under name, sometimes under the name of Guatemalan. And but then at the same time, in the mid 90s, in 1996, when the peace accords were signed, this established that the army had to withdraw from these positions, from key positions in the country. When they withdrew, the Colombians and local drug traffickers groups were already well established. Also, I want to bring your attention to the clandestine intelligence apparatuses that weren't dismantled. there is a notion that most of the organized crime structures operating in Guatemala come from these clandestine security networks. However, it's only one part that comes from these networks. These networks were formed or came from the counterinsurgency policies that were in place in Guatemala in the 80s. And then after the peace accords were signed, they weren't dismantled. And there's a belief that part of these structures also joined organized crime, and because they had contacts on the inside in state structures, then they continued. They were an asset to any organized crime network that was operating in the country, whether it was foreign or local. In the 1990s, with the withdrawal of the army from key positions in the country, the influence of the Colombian groups began to decline because the army officials were their main contact in the country. Also, there was around the mid 80s, there was a military operation in combination with U.S. forces that stopped an attempt of one of the Colombian cartels of establishing itself in the country. So between that and the withdrawal of the army, the power of the influence of the Colombian groups began to decline. And at the same time, the spaces they left in the local crime structures were filled by the Mexicans, who started to enter the country in larger groups at the end of the 90s. Then in the 2000s, the government between 2000 and, well, actually at the beginning of this decade, there was a further cut of the presence of the military. This also allowed a stronger presence of the Mexican cartels because there were more spaces left for the drug traffickers to operate. And not only drug traffickers, but any other type of organized crime, the illegal immigrants or trafficking persons, or any type of contraband. So also the peace process that had allowed for a new police force to be formed lacked the governments that followed after the peace process. They didn't observe the law completely in terms of following all the regulations that would allow a stronger police force. Instead, they kept using the army for security purposes, some say as a Band-Aid solution, as opposed to integrate it to the security policy. They were called in to, if there was a violent situation, let's say a violent demonstration, the army would be called in, or if there was a particular regional problem of the same nature, they would send the army in, but there wasn't, and there hasn't been an orchestrated, thought-out long-term plan to use the military in terms of security and protecting the country from organized crime. This led, of course, to the Mexican cartels to proliferate in the country. Now, in terms of the infiltration of state institutions, when the problem of organized crime is looked at in Guatemala, it's usually seen as the organized crime attacking the state and the government. However, it must be seen from both sides. The problem of organized crime is also inside the state, and it is in the form of corruption and at different levels. Again, the military and civilian authorities. And there are different reasons, but for instance, in terms of civilian authorities, since the 60s, there's been a tendency of appointing people to government positions as political favors. If there was a determined or next group of supporters voting for the party or campaigning for the official party, then they are offered different positions in the government. Sometimes these appointments are not necessarily made on the basis of these people having the proper professional qualifications for the positions. So then they become prone or vulnerable to being tempted by organized crime because they're not well prepared, or maybe the salary is not the right one, or it's not doesn't fulfill their needs. There are a number of different reasons, but the point is that having a weak public sector it's one of the vulnerabilities that organized crime has exploited in the Guatemalan state. And there's a civil service law that isn't applied. There's been a discussion of reforming the law in the Congress, but it always gets pushed back and it's not given the priority that it really deserves. The other point is the political parties. It could be seen as a positive element that there are many parties in Guatemala, but it's very easy or not very easy, but there are not that many requirements to form a political party. So as a result, right now the Congress has 14 different political parties represented there. And the lifespan of a political party is one government, two governments. The strongest ones have lasted 3 governments, but by the third one, they're very weak or practically non-existent. What is the importance of this? Many of these parties, when they are involved in policy, in either discussing security policies or in supporting different programs over the long term, sometimes these programs or these policies cannot be carried out over the long term because that party, one or several of the parties that were supporting this policy don't exist after a few years. So usually the policy doesn't get carried out, or when the person, whoever wins the presidency, the party hasn't lasted or hasn't existed long enough for that person to have been involved in policies that were discussed 2, 3, or 5 years prior to this person winning the presidency. So this also has its indirect factor, if you will, in worsening the security situation, because there isn't enough strong political structure to support security policies that would matter and that would help fight organized crime. Then the other, this is just a quick overview of how Central America is under fire, but I think it has been discussed at length already. But it just shows that there are different types of organized crime taking over the region, and basically Central America is under fire because it's a crucial route for, you name it, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, illegal immigration, and trafficking persons. At a local level, there are different links between the different types of crime. Basically, the ones that authorities or local authorities talk most about are kidnapping, which is happening mostly at a local level. Also, gang activity and extortion and small-scale drug distribution, which was mentioned a little while ago, the narcomenudeo. Drug traffickers have links with gangs for purposes of selling drugs that are sold at a local level and small scale. Car theft structures cater to drug traffickers, to gangs, and to kidnappers. Armed traffickers cater to drug traffickers, to car thieves, to kidnappers, to gangs. The current Minister of Interior said that while 3 years ago gangs usually had small guns or makeshift guns, now they have AK-47s and brand new, the newest models of guns you can imagine, brand new basically. So this means that they are definitely connected to an arms trafficking structure. This is just an overview of the organizations, the drug trafficking organizations that operate in Guatemala. There's an analyst from Guatemala who says that in looking at a map of organized crime, of drug trafficking, the main take or what one should do is throw away the map, because now there aren't fully defined territories. In fact, there are several territories that encompass different routes. So the traffickers are mostly concerned with guarding the routes than guarding entire territories. Previous reports have mentioned, for example, that the Huehuetenango area, the northwestern area of Guatemala, was mostly Sinaloa cartel area. However, the Zetas the entry point of the Zetas to Guatemala is Huehuetenango. They enter through Huehuetenango, and then they fly to Alta Verapaz, which is in the center of the country, and then they start spreading throughout the country from there. The Sinaloa route is basically described as the southwest. However, they have also partners in the eastern part, the eastern border, and the different small families that operate. I mean, most of the structures that operate in Guatemala are family-oriented. They the father is the patriarch of the structure. Then his sons or his sons-in-law join the structure. Here, most of the main groups are the Lorenzana and the Mendoza. 4 of the Lorenzanas are facing an arrest warrant from a case that's in actually a Washington, D.C. court. And the Mendozas don't have any arrest warrants, but they are everybody, including authorities, regard them as being involved in drug trafficking, although there isn't an arrest warrant against them in Guatemala, at least. And basically, the Zetas have taken over positions in the country that used to belong to the Gulf Cartel. When the Zetas separated from the Gulf Cartel as their hitman organization, actually they started separating in 2007, but they were working more independently, but they separated entirely in January of this year. And so the positions that they had been assigned to guard by the Gulf Cartel in Mexico, they tried to take them over, and the same thing happened in Guatemala. And so positions in Alta Verapaz or in the Atlantic coast, they have been taken over by the Zetas, and they've formed a corridor that is going from Mexico to the Honduran border and also to the Atlantic coast. I'm not going to extend myself too much because I think I already took more time than necessary. But I just wanted to finish by saying that it's important to consider that the problem of organized crime didn't start at the end of the conflict, or it doesn't stem alone from not dismantling the intelligence apparatuses that were formed during the war. This is a problem that began much earlier during the conflict, and also it was sheltered, let's say, to say it in one way, by the civil conflict. So it started growing, and then by the time the peace accords were signed, it was already full-blown, and the civilian authorities weren't fully prepared to deal with the problems that organized crime was causing. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. I'd like to mention that all of these papers that have been prepared for today's presentation are available on our website. They are drafts. We welcome comments, corrections, and they will be published sometime early in 2011. So please treat these as drafts, as working drafts, and we invite your commentary. I'll now turn to our two commentators. Christopher Ashe is the action officer in the State Department's Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, dealing with the Central America Regional Security Initiative, known by its acronym CARSI. He coordinates within the State Department the interagency planning process that has to do with the way that the U.S. government as a whole is attempting to respond to the crisis of organized crime in Central America. He's had postings all over the world, in Jakarta, in Helsinki, Finland, and had jobs both in and outside of government before joining the State Department in 2004. Juan Carlos Garzón is a friend and colleague. His book on Mafia and Company, The Criminal Networks in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil is also available for you to take outside the room, also on the website. I'd like to, in that regard, mention the Open Society Foundations and David Holliday, who's here, and thank him for his support for a number of these undertakings. Juan Carlos is a specialist at the Organization of American States in the Department of Democratic Stability and Special Missions in the Political Affairs Secretariat of the OAS. When I first met Juan Carlos, he was serving as an official of the mission to oversee the demobilization of the AUC paramilitary groups in Colombia, a task that was given to the OAS. He has been based in a number of universities, most particularly at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and has been one of the premier researchers on questions of organized crime involving Colombia and its linkages outside the Andean region. Juan Carlos will be speaking in Spanish. We have simultaneous interpretation. Those of you who might need headsets, if you want to raise your hand, we can run around and provide you with a headset. Juan Carlos, por favor.
Bueno, buenos días, muchas gracias, Cindy. Pues para mí fue una magnífica oportunidad leer estos papers, estos documentos sobre Centroamérica y especialmente sobre el Triángulo Norte, que me parece que es una pieza del rompecabezas que aún falta armar. Cuando yo leo los tres papers de corrido, pues la primera tentación es tratar de hacer una pintura, un escenario más regional, tratando de encontrar cosas comunes. Yo estoy convencido que para entender los mercados ilegales no hay que hacer una cosa muy distinta de cuando uno trata de analizar los mercados legales. Mi primera aproximación al crimen organizado yo creo que fue con las potencias hemisféricas en términos de crimen organizado, que son Colombia, México y Brasil. Yo llamaría a los países centroamericanos más bien países emergentes, digamos, si uno compara con las demás potencias. Entonces lo primero que quisiera hacer es tratar de hacer una caracterización de estos países emergentes a partir de los elementos contenidos en los diferentes papers. El primer salto que salta a la vista y que tal vez todos conozcamos es que son tres países que tienen niveles de violencia muy alto. Es decir, el crimen organizado está acompañado por una utilización de la violencia en altos niveles. Los tres papers coinciden en que Centroamérica es un corredor estratégico y eso no diferencia mucho lo que sucede con la economía legal. Incluso estos tres países son dependientes de las exportaciones de a Estados Unidos y con las mercancías ilegales sucede lo mismo. Estos tres países básicamente exportan mercancías ilegales a los Estados Unidos. Bueno, hay altos niveles de corrupción policial, altos niveles de impunidad, influencia del crimen organizado en las instituciones, especialmente en la justicia. Es una región muy turbia en términos de cómo se organiza el crimen, porque yo creo que hicieron un gran esfuerzo en tratar de armar un mapa de una cosa tan desorganizada, que es una mezcla entre maras, organizaciones que no necesariamente están dentro de las maras, pero que realizan actividades ilegales, redes clandestinas, pseudocarteles y además la influencia externa, especialmente de las estructuras colombianas y mexicanas. En Salvador y Guatemala, pues destaca el contexto posconflicto. Y a mí personalmente quedé muy sorprendido porque generalmente se ha pensado que si uno quiere ver la versión más actualizada del crimen, tiene que ver el caso colombiano. parece que los colombianos estuvieron un paso adelante en el tipo de organizaciones criminales. Y esa era un poco la hipótesis de mi libro, pero ahora con el trabajo que han hecho, especialmente lo que propone un poco Douglas, y yo creo que en Centroamérica las estructuras de red sucedieron mucho antes o sucedieron anteriormente que en países como Colombia. Es decir, en Centroamérica tenemos una disposición de estructuras criminales más sofisticado de lo que pensábamos en un principio, y que es hijo un poco de este escenario post-conflicto. También tendría que destacar un grave problema que creo que hay que poner en la agenda e insistir, que es el tema de la migración. La migración fluida y cómo eso se conecta con las actividades ilegales. Otro grave problema que también comparte con otros países es el tema de los graves problemas con los centros penitenciarios. Es decir, seguimos creando cárceles que en realidad son universidades. En estos lugares un marero entra con conocimientos básicos de cómo robar en la calle y sale cualificado para hacer otro tipo de delitos. También yo creo que el concepto tal vez que podría definir los tres papers es las conexiones. Es decir, parece que todo está muy conectado. Hay economías ilegales conectadas, entonces los criminales que se dedican al tráfico de drogas también invierten en el robo de vehículos, también invierten en el secuestro. Hay muchas conexiones, igual entre estructuras criminales. Las malas relacionadas con carteles mexicanos, policías corruptos relacionados con estructuras criminales, y lo más sorprendente es la conexión que hay entre el mundo ilegal y el mundo legal, que hace de esto una cuestión muy gris, y que creo que para las personas que hemos tenido la oportunidad de trabajar en Centroamérica, digamos, esa zona gris hace muy difícil saber con quién se puede trabajar y dónde estamos poniendo, pues, digamos, dónde se están poniendo los recursos. Creo que el crimen organizado, bueno, hay que tomárselo en serio, y creo que está redibujando las fronteras de los países. Es decir, una cosa es tomar el mapa del Triángulo Norte y mirar las fronteras, y otra cosa es hacer un dibujo a partir de los papers. Es decir, las fronteras empiezan a correr. Las fronteras parece que no importaran mucho para los criminales. Es decir, un tipo que actuaba en México termina operando en Honduras y después siendo capturado en Guatemala. No les importa mucho, no es un dato para los criminales las fronteras. Y otro tema que hace parte de la agenda y que es muy importante, que es el involucramiento de las Fuerzas Armadas. Ya creo que ese debate, para los que pensaban que había la oportunidad de que las Fuerzas Armadas no se involucraran, creo que ya es demasiado tarde. Es decir, creo que ahora hay que pensar en un desafío distinto. Las Fuerzas Armadas están en la calle, y eso se está reproduciendo en la mayoría de los países. La gran preocupación es qué va a pasar con el tema de los derechos humanos. Y además porque la participación de las Fuerzas Armadas a veces está basada en falsas hipótesis. Yo, por ejemplo, no compro la idea de que las Fuerzas Armadas sean menos corruptas que la policía. Eso tendríamos que verlo. Lo que sí estoy convencido es que la capacidad armada de las estructuras criminales sobrepasa a la mayoría de los aparatos criminales de la región. Es decir, si hace 2 semanas la policía de Río de Janeiro no fue capaz de controlar una favela y tuvo que pedir apoyo a las fuerzas militares de Brasil, ¿qué le podemos pedir a los países centroamericanos con las policías que tienen? Ahora, ¿cuál es el plan urgente? El plan urgente es dotar a la policía de las capacidades necesarias para que asuman su función, pero mientras tanto hay que ver cómo limitamos el papel de las fuerzas armadas, que creo que también es una característica de los 3 papers. Otra cuestión que me asombró, y es que el análisis del crimen organizado yo sentí que fue muy fluido. Se pueden identificar transiciones, aprendizajes, pero cuando se analiza la actuación del Estado, lo que uno analiza son rupturas planes de corto plazo. Es decir, es como si el crimen organizado tuviera un mejor plano, un plan de más largo plazo que las propias autoridades. Y esto es una grave preocupación. Yo quisiera señalar 3 elementos que me sorprendieron o que resultaron para mí novedosos, muy novedosos en estos papers. No novedosos en la realidad, sino novedosos puestos en el análisis. Lo primero que yo quisiera resaltar es la vinculación del crimen organizado con la política y el impacto en la política. En El Salvador, pues es impresionante y creo que Douglas lo pone muy bien, hay conexiones, lo señala él en su paper, Partido Comunista, FMLN, miembros de Arena, con el crimen organizado. En Honduras, creo que fue un análisis muy novedoso, tratar de ligar lo que pasaba en la dinámica del golpe de Estado con el crimen organizado, que es un ejercicio que casi nunca se hace, y cómo el golpe afectó la capacidad del Estado de responder a la ofensiva de los criminales. Y en Guatemala, creo que uno recorre el paper y, bueno, ha habido vinculaciones de funcionarios del gobierno con el crimen organizado. En el Congreso también hay casos muy discientes. Entonces creo que la vinculación del crimen organizado con la política es una cosa que hay que prestarle atención y que tiene que ver mucho con el tema del fortalecimiento institucional. El segundo elemento es Nicaragua, porque en los papers aparece Nicaragua y creo que hay que preguntarnos realmente qué pasa en Nicaragua, porque parece que hay una fuerte influencia en términos de economías ilegales del Triángulo Norte con Nicaragua, y no tenemos muy claro qué pasa en Nicaragua, porque además, digamos, en Nicaragua los niveles de violencia son mucho menores. Es más, la preocupación de los ciudadanos por la seguridad es mucho menor. Pero los 3 papers coinciden en que hay muchos vínculos de estos 3 países con Nicaragua. Entonces creo que es una tarea pendiente. Y además quisiera resaltar pues también que, bueno, yo he seguido más de cerca el tema colombiano y el tema mexicano, y creo que lo que alguna vez analizamos como el efecto globo en la producción, es decir, que cuando en Colombia disminuían los cultivos, aumentaban en Perú y en Bolivia, pues también creo que hay un efecto globo en términos de que las estructuras criminales, cuando se sienten presionadas en los países, buscan otros mercados. Y creo que una tarea pendiente es mirar y hacer un buen análisis de cómo las estructuras mexicanas han empezado a ocupar Centroamérica. Ayer las autoridades costarricenses hablan de que el cartel de Sinaloa ya está en Costa Rica. Y si uno se va para Sudamérica, pues uno recorre países como Bolivia, Argentina o Chile, y los que están ahí son colombianos o mexicanos. Y ahí quería aprovechar creo que hay como que seguir los buenos ejemplos. Hay un buen libro que se llama Mafia Export. Lo hizo el jefe de la Comisión Parlamentaria Italiana sobre la Antimafia. Y se ha dedicado a hacer mapas de cómo las estructuras italianas han colonizado el mundo. Ahora creo que hay que hacer una tarea y es mirar cómo las estructuras mexicanas y colombianas han colonizado el resto de América Latina. Y además, porque creo que eso da un elemento de evaluación adicional. Yo compro en parte la idea de que el caso colombiano ha sido exitoso. También hay varios defectos de la respuesta que se ha dado en el caso colombiano. Pero creo que por lo menos la evaluación de lo que ha pasado en Colombia no solamente tiene que pasar por lo que pasa en Colombia, sino lo que pasa fuera de Colombia. Es decir, si nosotros pensamos que el modelo colombiano es un modelo a seguir, pues yo creo que tenemos que pensar también cómo ese modelo a seguir lo que ha hecho es esparcir la presencia de estructuras criminales colombianas a otras partes del continente. Y voy a terminar con una sugerencia humilde sobre tal vez yo a qué le apuntaría para cerrar los papers. Yo creo que es importante dos cosas. Primero, arriesgarnos a hacer escenarios. Es decir, ¿cómo nos imaginamos esto en 10 años? ¿Hacia dónde vamos? ¿Cuáles son las tendencias? Y yo creo que ahí hay 5 puntos que observar, pues que creo que son motivo de preocupación. Primero, las relaciones de subordinación entre estructuras criminales. Es decir, ¿quién manda a quién? Y creo que un buen ejemplo de por qué esto es importante analizar es lo que pasó con los Zetas y el cartel del Golfo. Los Zetas en principio eran una organización dedicada a ofrecer protección al cartel del Golfo. Y en un par de años, y no muchos, ahora los Zetas manejan su propia economía ilegal y aprendieron del negocio. Y yo creo que ese mismo ejemplo, o ese mismo antecedente, tendríamos que mirarlo, por ejemplo, en el caso de las maras. ¿Quién subordina a quién? ¿Quién manda a quién? ¿Los carteles están mandando a las maras? ¿Cuál va a ser el proceso de aprendizaje de las maras? ¿Están en la capacidad de ser organizaciones autónomas? ¿Ya lo están siendo? Para algunos, sí. Y creo que el ejercicio de prospectiva debería un poco apuntar a qué va a pasar en el futuro, cómo nos imaginamos las maras en el futuro y cómo nos imaginamos la presencia de los carteles mexicanos. Porque hay una cosa más muy importante, y es que la presencia de los carteles mexicanos y colombianos han desestabilizado la organización criminal que había en Centroamérica. Una organización criminal que además tenía cierta relación con las élites de estos países. Y creo que la mayor presencia de recursos y estructuras criminales se ha traducido en la formación de élites emergentes en las zonas rurales. Élites emergentes que basan su capacidad en economías ilegales. Hace algunos años, en un país como Guatemala, ¿quién tenía la plata para financiar elecciones? La élite tradicional. Hoy, y no, el próximo año, ¿quién tiene el dinero para financiar elecciones? Ya no solamente la élite tradicional, ahora los recursos también están en otros lados. Entonces creo que eso es un asunto que hay que mirar. El tercero, la consolidación de los mercados locales, que creo que también se insinúa, digamos, en los papers. Parte de los mercancías ilegales se está quedando en estos países, y eso está haciendo que se formen mercados locales. Y ya los narcotraficantes y otras organizaciones criminales han aprendido que hay que formar mercados locales. El mercado local, si bien no da tantos recursos, provee de un flujo de dinero constante, que es más regular que los recursos que se exportan. Y eso creo que tiene graves consecuencias para nuestros países. Hoy el tema, por ejemplo, uno de los temas centrales en Colombia es precisamente el narcomenudeo y cómo eso afecta a las ciudades. Si uno va a cualquiera de nuestros países, uno de los graves problemas es jóvenes comprando drogas a precios asequibles, y que creo que eso es un punto que hay que mirar. Cuarto punto, ¿hacia dónde se está dirigiendo el desarrollo de la economía ilegal geográficamente? Estamos acostumbrados un poco a que el narcotráfico se desarrollaba en las zonas rurales. Incluso todavía en Centroamérica parte de la afectación es en zonas rurales. Pero yo creo que hay que fijarse bien en las ciudades. O sea, yo creo que en realidad la transición se está haciendo del campo a la ciudad. Y nuestras ciudades cada vez se están viendo más afectadas por la presencia del crimen organizado. Lo que pasó en San Salvador es una buena muestra de eso. La ciudad quedó bloqueada por un par de horas. ¿Por qué? Porque las maras han apostado a controlar un sector estratégico de la ciudad, que es el transporte. Pero también invierten en basura, también invierten en controlar otros sectores estratégicos de la ciudad. Y creo que nuestras ciudades no están preparadas para responder al desafío del crimen organizado. Y para terminar, yo quisiera señalar un quinto elemento, que es cómo el crimen organizado se va desarrollando a partir de cambios en las condiciones políticas. Es decir, el crimen organizado se va adaptando a cómo la política va cambiando. Y creo que ahí yo me hago 3 preguntas, que es cómo la agenda de la seguridad y especialmente la respuesta al crimen organizado va a traducirse en un país como El Salvador. en donde hay una polarización política que ha incluido la discusión sobre el tema de seguridad. Es decir, respondemos con mano dura, ¿quiénes son los partidos políticos que le apuestan a la mano dura? ¿Qué va a pasar con los sectores más blandos? Y cómo, digamos, las autoridades van a responder a este contexto de polarización. Otro tema, a partir de las condiciones políticas, las elecciones en Guatemala el próximo año. Va a ser bien importante la actividad de observación que se haga y tratar de acompañar estas elecciones. Diferentes fuentes hablan de que alrededor del 40% del territorio de Guatemala hay presencia de estructuras criminales. ¿Cómo se van a dar las elecciones en esos lugares? Y por último, pues, digamos, la etapa posgolpe en Honduras, que es al final, ¿cuál es el rol de las fuerzas militares? Y si van a seguir distraídos en tareas que no les corresponden. Y más bien se van a enfocar a atacar atacar el grave problema que hay ahora. Honduras, digamos, está en el top de los países con mayores tasas de homicidio. Yo creo que, digamos, esos son las inquietudes y digamos, lo que me estimuló. En realidad los papers me parecieron, digamos, muy dicientes y creo que es una buena tarea la que hay que emprender. Terminaría.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. Chris.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having the State Department here this morning to give our perspective on the citizen safety environment in Central America. I'm going to talk very quickly, which is something I usually do, so hopefully I'll have room for questions at the end if I skip over something. Within Central America, we have the Central America Regional Security Initiative. It used to be called Merida Central America, but the way the Congress does our legislation and the appropriations, last year we changed it to CARSI, and that's what we'll have moving forward. We think it brings attention to the region as a standalone and delinks it a bit from Mexico. I'm going to give a quick overview of what we see as the challenges in the region, some of the things we're doing, and hopefully in the question period you can offer some solutions for us. It's a daunting challenge. What is nice today, though, is to see a large group. I mean, I figured we'd get 20 or 25 people. And to see this many people interested in Central America certainly is a boost to those of us who work the issue day in and day out.
There's an overflow room, too.
Oh, overflow. That's great. Wherever you are. Hi. It's like a courtroom for a federal trial. So it's great to have all the people here. Again, we mostly have frustration in Central America. There are a lot of opportunities we're working on, but unlike other places in the world where things happen a little faster, we have far more challenges that are they're institutionalized in the region, which make it difficult for us to have success. I've been working on Central America since October of 2008, and I'm glad to see that since Secretary Clinton went to Guatemala in March of this year, and met with the regions of the leader, she came back emboldened. Central America had not gotten much attention within the State Department. Mexico had been the focus. And literally since March, we've seen Secretary Clinton take a personal interest in Central America. She talks regularly to the foreign ministers and and presidents of the country. There's a high level of engagement, again, from the Secretary, from our National Security Council down, saying Central America is important. Our successes in Colombia and Mexico have caused spillover effects. And as one of the other panelists mentioned, the cocaine flows are going through Central America. Close to 90% actually goes through Central America itself, in the literal waters, on the land, through the air. They crash, they land, they do many things in Central America, but it's happening there. In terms of Central America, since October of 2008, things have gotten worse, and this is my perspective. But when I started working the issue, Guatemala was the focus of the attention, but you never heard about Belize, and we have our Belize desk officer here. And now you have children being gunned down in their sleeps by indiscriminate bullets from domestic gangs in the southern part of Belize City. We hadn't heard that 2 years ago. Recently I've heard about narco cattle, and I thought, great, we've got to deal with people. Now there are cattle running drugs. But, of course, they're using cattle to create cattle ranches where you have these emaciated, sick cattle, but they use the fields for the cattle as landing strips in Guatemala and other parts of the country. You have in Honduras and Guatemala, you have homicide rates that exceed the combined homicide rates of the entire European Union. I mean, that is just an incredible figure, and we don't give that much attention, but when you put it in that perspective, I think it's 27 plus countries, it's bad. What the Department of State and I think the U.S. government and the nations of the region have realized is citizen security is the issue for the region. We can talk about economic growth, we can talk about free trade, we can talk about a number of other peripheral issues, but without citizen safety and safe streets, social inclusion is not possible, economic development and investment will not happen, and people of the countries will lose confidence in the leaders of their countries to solve the issues that challenge them and their children, and the hope to move forward for their countries and for their development and inclusion in the broader world economy and different types of things that they can take advantage for. So, within the State Department, as many of the panelists have mentioned, narcotics trafficking and its roots through Central America have been probably one of the leading problems in most of the countries. Domestic demand is there. 10 years ago, it was minor, and today they are commoditizing narcotics as part of the flows. You have domestic demand, which countries, they have enough trouble taking care of other issues, now they have narcotics issues. Gangs actually in many of the countries are becoming far worse. They're the visible presence of crime and criminality that you see at the street level. When parents can't let their children play in the street because they may get hit by a bullet, they're concerned about sending them to schools, and we're seeing in Salvador, in elementary schools, they're trying to recruit children into gangs. Those are big problems, and those are things that are threatening, again, societies and the fabric of societies in the region. We have narcotics trafficking, but we also have firearms trafficking. That's one of the different enablers, not only into the region and stockpiles that came from the conflicts. We have military stockpiles leaking from the governments. That's a concern, of course. We have hand grenades. There was a car bomb that almost went off in Guatemala, which would have been the largest car bomb since the civil conflict in terms of a big explosion in a country. We have basically corruption is endemic throughout all levels of government in Central America. You have some countries that are better, you have others that are worse, but in general, corruption's an issue. You have massive income disparities. You have the wealthy who can afford to pay for the private security services, and they have a non-incentive to invest in the government. And so you have police, which are underfunded, and you have tax systems, which, again, they do not have the capability in Central America to generate, in most countries, the taxes needed to fund the police, to fund rule of law institutions. I was in El Salvador recently, last year, and, I was with some policemen in a police car, and they were given 6 bullets per year in, guns that hold 14 rounds, and it was amazing to me. And I said, well, what happens when you're in a fight? And, each of them had been in gunfights within the past 6 years, twice each, which in the U.S., that's to have, Sheriff Fife will probably never even pull his gun out. They said, well, when we run out of the 6 bullets, we go back to the police station and get more. I mean, that's not serious. So we have issues where the prisons, by and large, are run by the prisoners. Yes, we put them there, or they put them there, but they have cell phones that have leaked in. They did some work in prisons in Honduras recently, and they found hand grenades, detonation cord. These are inside the prisons. It's, how does it get in? Corruption. We have basically prosecutors who don't trust the police because of the educational disparity. We have judges who don't know how to manage cases. So within Central America, we focus on the front end of the system in terms of let's catch the bad guys. And bad guys is kind of the easy way to describe them. But then they go into a system which is incapable of processing them. Many people are in detention for years on minor charges. In the United States, if it's a minor charge, like a driving under the influence, you're probably going to be put on bail until your trial. In some of these countries, you're there until your trial. And if your file gets lost, you're there until they find it. So there are issues with that. And then there is extremely high impunity rates of 90% in some of these countries. So even if you do kill someone, you've got maybe at best, a 2 to 8% chance of actually going before a judge. And those are the people who are brought to a judge. And then, you can pay off the prosecutor, and the police know that. So why catch somebody if the prosecutors are corrupt? And then they go to the prison where if you're a gang member, it's like, hey, you're safer than if you're on the streets and you can still run your operation. And the other issue, though, is there's a lot of children get thrown into prisons for minor charges. And once you're in the prison as a child in Central America, It's welcome to gang central in many of the countries. So they have very little in terms of post-prison rehabilitation. There isn't a lot in terms of alternative sentencing up front. So you've got systems that are really, they're overwhelmed by what's happening in the region. And so from the State Department's perspective, we're not just looking at let's stop the drugs from flowing north. We recognize that we have a shared responsibility, as Secretary Clinton and President Obama have mentioned, shared responsibility in interdicting drugs, reducing domestic demand. But the CARSI program, which to date represents $260 million, and I won't get into the fiscal years, it's confusing enough figuring out the new year is coming. But our fiscal year 08, 09, and 10 was $260 million for the 7 nations of Central America. I won't go into who got what, why, and where. And for fiscal year 2011, which started October 1st, and if you've followed the paper, the budget's, I'm not sure where it is today, we are asking with the administration for another $100 million for the nations of Central America. It's a huge amount of money. It's not enough. In terms of the U.S. government investment in the region, it is the largest infusion of law enforcement assistance ever in the nations of Central America. Now, when I said it's not enough, again, the governments of the region, some have stepped up to the challenge and have started to invest. Panama, Costa Rica are great examples. Others have not. Others are trying to. Frankly, one of the issues we talk about more and more is political will. Most of the problems in the region are not the United States' problems. We've contributed to some of them, we're working on them, but the leaders of the different nations of Central America have to step up and they have to do the right thing. They have to raise taxes, they have to get tough on corruption, they need to fund their rule of law institutions, which when I say rule of law institutions, it's courts, it's prisons, it's the police, and they have to address the root causes of crime, which is a lot of people, I don't know if anybody from our Agency for International Development's here, it's the soft side. They hate the term soft side. But it's not just go out and get the bad guys. So we are working within the region on a number of different issues. We do have the law enforcement side of CARSI, which is actually quite significant. It is working on police training. It's providing equipment to the police. It's not providing, armored personnel carriers. It's providing bulletproof vests so they can go in the gang neighborhoods, and if they get shot at least there's a better chance that they'll survive that. It's providing communications equipment so they can actually talk to each other. It's doing community policing, which actually is very effective, trying to go into communities with model precincts and try to have the police interact more effectively with the communities so they know where the crimes are before they take root. We have an International Law Enforcement Academy in San Salvador, which is focusing on mid-level training, which is important. Most of the academies in Central America, and it's shocking, like in Belize, and I don't mean to pick on Belize, but I was there, they get training in their firearm once in their career when they go in the academy, and when I was at their training academy, I said, well, how well do you have to do? And I was there with an ATF agent, who are some of our best in firearms. They said, oh, well, we don't have to really hit the target. We just have to show we can shoot a gun. And I said, well, when do you practice again? And they said, oh, we never get tested again. And we share our guns, and a lot of the times they're rusty and they misfire. So, the training academies, that's something we're focusing on in the entry level, but also mid-level and senior training. It's really a holistic approach to the police. They need to be professional and they need to do the right thing. We're doing a lot with what we call vetted units, which is we polygraph people in the local law enforcement so they can work on joint investigations with the U.S. to try to deter narcotics, human trafficking, firearms trafficking. We're doing a lot in terms of maritime interdiction, and part of that is beyond the CARSI budget with the Department of Defense and Coast Guard and Department of Homeland Security in terms of trying to stop the maritime and the aerial trafficking of narcotics into the region. Bulk cash smuggling, we heard that before. The movement of cash is just very easy. We've done a lot of work on border assessments and security, and the borders are wide open in Central America. Here's the little checkpoint. Well, to the left and right, 100 yards down the road, there are roads with trucks going like this, and nobody stops them. And we have one picture, which is kind of sad. It's on the Guatemalan Mexican border of two 50-gallon drums, probably full of drugs. And there were actually a couple of little kids who were probably 10 years old holding a rope between the two barrels, and they were charging a toll for people to go back and forth between Mexico and Guatemala. And the reason it's kids is not because they have an entrepreneurial spirit in Guatemala. It's the traffickers will have them do that because they know if the kids are arrested, they won't be put in jail. But if you're an adult, then you're going to jail. Well, maybe, again, because of the impunity rates being so low, high. So, the borders are open, so we're doing a lot there, trying to do targeted enforcement so we can get the big hits. We're doing a lot of work in terms of the Agency for International Development and at-risk youth, which frankly, every dollar you spend there has a far greater return than the hard side we do. Going into neighborhoods which are really, the poverty is grinding. I've been in some of the worst neighborhoods in San Salvador, and I've seen these projects in MS-13 neighborhoods where you've got the big 13s on the wall, and I didn't know I should be taking pictures in a suit, but I still survived. I was with a nun, thank God. And but you talk to these children, and they have no hope. I mean, there was a beautiful soccer field in one neighborhood I went to that the Canadians paid for. And I noticed that there was nobody in the soccer field. It was during a school break period, and I said, well, why isn't anybody at the soccer field? Well, the MS-13 haven't given people permission to play on the Canadian soccer field today. So, I mean, we really do need to work on, again, the community level, re-empowering communities. And the other thing is, one of the panelists mentioned, there are large parts of territory which, frankly, governments don't control, especially in Honduras and Guatemala, partially in Belize, in areas where they can't get to, and actually neighborhoods and city centers like San Salvador. I mean, yes, the police car will quickly drive through. There's a flag. There's probably a little community building. But the government does not exercise effective control. And when you have that, you have a big problem. You have people who are receiving, in some of these countries, their social services not from the government, but from traffickers, as a way of keeping them, okay, don't make trouble. And, but if you do make trouble, we'll kill you. It's what, the silver or the bullet? I forget what the saying is in Spanish, but it's there you go. So I mean, that it's real in Central America, and we're working to try to reestablish control of the territory. We're also working on donor coordination. That's critical. Open Society's here. We actually have started exchanging info with them last week, which is great, and some of the programs they're doing. We believe that there's approximately 1.2 or $4 billion in security assistance going into Central America right now. Okay, we're doing, 260 million. There's a lot that's going in, and frankly, a lot of the Central American governments, they ask us all for the same thing and get it maybe 2 or 3 different times in different forms. There's a lot of good that can be done by more effectively coordinating the work of the U.S. government with the international financial institutions and with the other major donors in the region, because frankly, it's a problem that one country like the U.S. or Canada or Spain cannot solve, and it's frankly beyond the capabilities of each individual country in Central America to address especially the transnational threats. So our Assistant Secretary Arturo Valenzuela has had donor coordination calls. I've been meeting with the Inter-American Development Bank. We're meeting with the World Bank. Anybody who has a footprint in Central America, it's not, let's see, compete against each other. It's really, how can we co-opt our programs, add and leverage where possible, so that at the end of the day, we're going in a more coordinated fashion to provide what we think, in coordination with the host nations, is needed to make a difference. There are a lot of projects you can invest in, and one problem in Central America, the issue of sustainability is becoming important for us. We found that many of our projects, if the check or the funding stops, a week later the car is rusting, or there's no oil, or frankly, all the people we had been paying for helping to put in a model precinct could disappear. Frankly, we need to be targeted in projects that the host government will do. Again, it speaks to political will. If the leaders of Central America are not going to address their problems seriously with our assistance and others, the question, especially in a very tough budget environment in the United States, will be, why are we doing it then? So we're taking a very hard approach in terms of working with the nations, trying to encourage them to work with each other, given that they have weak institutional capabilities on a regional basis in Central America, to have one voice on transnational issues, but to more effectively work with us bilaterally and with an international community. And finally, one thing that had not been happening before CARSI, there had been in general a lack of coordination in terms of within the U.S. government. We have a lot of different law enforcement agencies, lots of guys with guns, handcuffs. We have a lot of people doing development work. We have implementers doing development work for the development company. I mean, it was lots of people, even within the U.S. government, that were not trying to achieve common objectives. And we've brought them all not under control, but in terms of the level of coordination in the last 2 years, we've made massive leaps in terms of having meetings. We know what we're all doing. We know that when Customs and Border Protection is doing something, what's the impact for DEA? Is there a firearms trafficking aspect for ATF? Immigration and Customs Enforcement, can they find a U.S. nexus to broaden an investigation? It's making a difference, and it's things that don't cost much. It's just the level of communication has increased within the U.S. government, by an order of magnitude, and that helps everyone. So I've kind of given you a snapshot. I haven't talked to the organized crime per se, but organized crime is facilitated by many of the things I've talked about. And again, the U.S. is committed, and Secretary Clinton is definitely committed to the region, and I think that speaks well for the region, and I appreciate any questions you might have. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone for some very excellent as well as extremely sobering presentations. Let's open the floor to comments and questions. Please identify yourself and wait for the microphone. I see a hand over here. Yes, this gentleman. If you could wait for the mic.
Hi, Cindy. My name's Frank Smythe. Nice to see you, and Doug. And Julie, nice to finally meet you. I have two quick questions for you, Julie. In terms of the issue of the degree to which the clandestine security networks or intelligent networks may be involved in Guatemala, in the early 2000s, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Cass Ballinger, pushed the Bush administration to do something about Guatemala, and they ultimately decertified the country during the Serrano administration. But before they did, they denied the U.S. entry visas to the former top two intelligence chiefs explicitly for their alleged involvement and complicity in drug trafficking and related crimes. And I wonder, if you think about the notion of that Juan Carlos raised of subordination, there's a lot of evidence that the Lorenzanos and the Mendozas and others were able to rise through the drug trade because they were protected by and had relations with some of these same intelligence chiefs who then became drug trafficking suspects. So I wonder if you could address that. And the second point, which may be related, why does Guatemala have one of the worst records for either prosecuting or extraditing major drug trafficking suspects in comparison to Mexico or Colombia, and I think to all the other nations? They haven't prosecuted any major figures in their own country since the early 90s that I'm aware of, and they've only extradited a handful of low-level heroin traffickers since the 1994 murder of the Chief Justice. So if you could address that. Thank you.
Well, on the first...
Wait, Julie, hold on. We'll take a couple questions and then come back to the panelists. Yes, this gentleman here. Adam, behind you there. There we go.
Thank you very much. Mike Jajic from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'd like to follow up on that question. I'm particularly interested at the Institute of Peace in the legacy of peace processes and whether we leave the door open for this kind of continuing activity. And in El Salvador, if I could sum it up, I say at least there's a fight going on. But in Guatemala, the question is, are the police, the security forces, and the civilian elites part of the problem or part of the solution, which kind of gets to your question. So what do we do about it? And you mentioned Cicig. So my question to Julie is, is this part of the solution? But it's only prosecution. Carlos Castro-Insana made some considerable progress in terms, I think he had indicted about 140 senior people, former president, a couple of ministers of interior, etc. But as Chris mentions, where do you go from there? So is Cicig a solution to this problem, but what else do we need to put in place in order for it to be effective?
I have a question which comes off of something that Juan Carlos said, that the way that Colombia serves as a model or to suggest lessons for fighting organized crime, and particularly drug trafficking, might be relevant. And my question to you, Juan Carlos, but also inviting the comments of other panelists, is the legacy of the Uribe years, the message that security in a military sense is the precondition for doing all of the things. A number of the presentations have talked about the lack of state presence throughout the national territory. Chris just mentioned that. Is the takeaway from Colombia that you have to do that first? And if that is the takeaway, how do you approach that in the Central American context, given the difficulty of involving the armed forces in the internal security functions, given the legacy of an institution like the Guatemalan Army coming from the counterinsurgency era, how would you approach the issue of restoring security in a Central American context, if in fact I understood you correctly, that that's an important lesson of Colombia? Diana, Nikki here.
Diana Negroponte, the Brookings Institution. We all talk about shared, but let's be specific on this. The number of deportations in 2009 and this year have increased significantly. Chris, it may be unfair to address this to you, but you're talking about greater coordination. What is the nature of the coordination with ICE and justice to ensure that we do not overwhelm law enforcement in the three countries that we've talked about, plus Nicaragua, Belize, to make it unsustainable to contain that violence as young men and women return to base camp?
All right, let's take a first round of, we'll come back to you, Margaret. We'll take a first round of comments from the panelists and then return to you for questions. Julie.
Well, regarding the former military officials who were targeted by withdrawing their visas, this unfortunately, although, well, on the first hand, it didn't allow them to travel to the States, but it really didn't make a dent on the organized crime structures or the clandestine apparatuses operating in Guatemala. At this point, families like the Lorenzanas are so entrenched in their own territory that they have already progressed past the point of needing this kind of protection that they might have had in the last, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago. And that I want to address something said a while ago regarding the voids of power and security presence in different parts of the territory, because there's a void of state presence. These families have like one of the panelists was saying a little while ago, they have provided the services that the state is supposed to provide. So now protection is not only coming from clandestine apparatuses, but also from the population itself. The communities, when a couple of times when there was a military operation to try and arrest the Lorenzanas, there was a demonstration of the people from the town where these people live, where the Lorenzanas live, against the police, and they wouldn't let the police get near or they were trying not to let the police get near the Lorenzana property. So going back to the visa issue, it hasn't, what has accomplished is not letting these people travel to the States, but other than that, it hasn't affected local criminal networks. Now, regarding the difficulty in extraditing drug lords, the answer is impunity and corruption, because there's so much corruption in the police force. Usually, these people have contacts that will let them know whether there's going to be a search warrant. There is a search warrant or an arrest warrant against them, and this has allowed them to escape in time. That's one of the reasons why the last person who was, well, actually this year there was one Guatemalan arrested with an extradition request from the States in October. But before him, the last person who had been arrested with an extradition request was Arnoldo Vargas in 1990. So in the last 20 years, any major Guatemalan drug trafficker that has been arrested outside Guatemala. In Mexico, in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Colombia, but not in Guatemala. And it's basically corruption. They have links or contacts in the police structure or in the courts or in the prosecution system that will let them know whether there's a case against them or an arrest warrant. Regarding the question on the Cicig, the International Commission Against Impunity, it's definitely part of the solution, but it will be part of the solution as long as there is institutional strengthening accompanying what the Commission is doing. The Commission, last year, in April, a few months before Castrezana left the Commission, he was saying that well, actually, I got to interview him for a few minutes, and I was asking him if he thought that if he saw the situation in Guatemala as a glass that's half full or half empty, and he said that the glass was almost empty. But that a small corner of the problem was being fixed because they're working with a small number of police officers, small number of prosecutors and judges. However, it's not enough because this is just a small percentage of the judicial system. And although the Cicig's mandate has been extended for 2 more years, it's not been made official yet, but the president has made public statements indicating that it will be renewed next year. The question is what will happen after Cicig leaves, because now there are different issues in security and in the justice system that the Cicig has been able to provide for. But once there aren't any funds, foreign funds, supporting Cicig, like it's happening now, it's a matter of whether there will be enough political will for the judicial system to have enough funds. And just to give you one little example, there were 2 families that had to leave the country under the protection the witness protection program, and the government couldn't send them abroad because it didn't have any money. It was the Cicig who had to pay for these families to leave the country because their lives were in danger after they testified in a high-impact case. So yes, Cicig is part of the solution, but it will be to the extent that the government can provide, or the state of Guatemala can provide enough funds for the judicial system to work properly. Thank you.
Can I just talk to I'll address the deportee issue, which is always the lightning rod here. But in terms of the use of the military in the region, we're pretty consistent in telling the countries that the use of the military is not good. It's not sustainable. Frankly, short term, it can make sense. If you look at Belize, I kind of think they do it right. When they deploy the military, and they've done a lot of it actually, they've had Coast Guard, police in Belize City, it's always the law enforcement officer who's in charge of the little patrol. And it's clear that it's led by the civilian law enforcement, and that's something that actually can work in a place like Belize, where you do need, because of the weapons being used, people who have bigger weapons in the military. That tends to be, in the government, which is the military. Also, the use of the military in policing the borders, of course, makes sense, with the law enforcement who are in charge of customs and immigration, and they do a lot of that in the region. In some countries like Guatemala and Salvador, you've actually had the military deployed, which, given the civil conflict, would be surprising. People don't object. But in the case of Salvador, people are quite supportive of that. The issues you run into is when you put, and frankly, the reason they use the military is people believe the military are less corrupt than the police forces. So that's probably the driving factor why governments can do that now, even though they have the civil conflicts. But the militaries in the region are stressed in terms of capability, resources. One thing they aren't provided with is training on what do you do in a civilian law enforcement environment. You know, they go into a neighborhood with an M16 assault rifle, and they're not told what excessive force is. And if you shoot an M16 in, a slum area, it's going to go through 4 or 5 walls if you're lucky and probably kill a couple of people. And there have been, we've heard from a couple of governments that, some people have died and, it was too bad, excessive force. And that it is a concern. You don't want to undermine the credibility of the police by saying, because you can't do your job, we're putting the guys in green on the streets. So in some cases where you're having violent crime in a neighborhood, putting them there temporarily and clearly having the law enforcement as the lead is something that governments probably have to do, but it's not sustainable. In terms of deportees, that's something we have, of course, it's a big issue. Frankly, the real solution is the governments of the region have to create the economic growth to employ people so they don't have to come to the United States illegally. It's again what I mentioned earlier. They're not addressing root issues of crime or of the immigration issue. Until governments invest in the education of their young people and provide the economic growth that can employ them and give them an alternative, frankly, they're going to continue to come to the United States where you can earn higher salaries. The issue in terms of deportees, criminal deportees are people who have, entered the United States illegally and they have committed a crime against an American citizen. U.S. immigration laws written by the Congress states that they will be deported. So in terms of the process, I mean, the State Department isn't involved in the legal aspects of a deportation. It's clear in U.S. law. In fact, if they're in the United States for 180 days, they are required by law to be released with a monitoring bracelet on their leg. And they could have been somebody who murdered 5 people, but after 180 days, they are on the street, and they do sometimes commit additional crimes. So the goal of the Department of Homeland Security is try to get them back to their country of origin as quickly as possible once they're detained. The role of the Department of State is working with the interagency community to make sure governments of the region know who's coming, and if they have committed crimes in the past, what they have done. It provides the host nations with information in terms of, are they gang members? But, frankly, if they've been in the United States, they've served a term in a prison, they're released, as an American would be. So, there's also a balance of when we provide this information to other countries, if they, in fact, have done their debt to society in America and they're being deported, they shouldn't be persecuted in the country they arrive in. So we do work with host nations. We don't want surprises, and that's something as part of CARSI. We're doing funding on that. We are working to make sure that criminal information exchange is part of what we're doing with the nations of the region. There shouldn't be a surprise when somebody shows up. But again, there has to be that balance of, believe it or not, the deportee's privacy, that they're not going to be singled out for special attention for something they've already, again, served their debt to society here for.
Other panelists, Boz, Doug?
Okay. I'm going to address both the Cicig question and the Colombia model question, because I think in some ways they're related, and it goes to how these countries need to view their long-term strategy. How do you view a 10-year, 20-year sort of model? Because in both cases, even the head of Cicig will say he's just a stopgap measure. The Cicig is there in Guatemala, and there's a rather intense debate in Honduras at the moment over whether Cicig should or whether a version of Cicig, something similar, should be in Honduras because they lack the same prosecution and judicial abilities. It's a stopgap measure. In the end, you can't sustain something like that for 10 or 15 years. You're having an outside organization come in and overtake certain portions of the state, what definitely should be a nation-state role. And so, yes, it's part of the short-term solution, but in this case, coming up with a strategy and a vision for how you're going to fix the problem over the long term is necessary. And that also goes to the Colombia model, in the sense that Colombia's military was fighting for 30 years before they finally started actually doing anything correct to start defeating the FARC and get rid of the AUC influence. It took them a really long time, and it wasn't the fact that they involved the military as much as they provided the military with a vision and a plan for success. And where Colombia has a mixed record is their ability then to transition away from a military sort of clear hold and actually find a way to build civilian institutions, civilian police forces that can replace the military in certain rural areas. I think one question that needs to be looked at over the long term, and I think Chris is right in the sense that some of this is also downstream. They're able to arrest some of these people, and then they can't try them, they can't prosecute them. That needs to be done. In the long term, they also need to look at rural areas because it may be that civilian police forces can't manage, and when I say rural, I don't mean somewhat rural, I mean the completely depopulated regions of countries. In Honduras, in the eastern section of Honduras, where there's very, very minimal civilian presence, I was told if the Navy wasn't there, nobody would be there. It may be impossible to create civilian government agencies to deal with the completely underpopulated areas, but other than that, it really does have to be a civilian solution, and that long-term vision becomes important.
I just want to add briefly on the intelligence structures. I think that the legacy of the intelligence structures is one of the most important things that we don't look at in the peace processes. And I think if you look at El Salvador, immediately after the new police was formed, immediately the FMLN folks had their own lines of intelligence to their people. The folks who came in out of the National Guard and the other groups immediately had their own intelligence structures that were parallel to the police. And what you see now in El Salvador is that the Cubans have provided the FMLN party with an intelligence apparatus. The Miami exile community has provided funding for very sophisticated AREN or right-wing military intelligence gathering structure, and the people that don't have any money is the government. Because Funes is desenchufado from the FMLN significantly, his head of intelligence, I've known for years, I think is a really good guy, and they're the only people who really don't know what's going on in the country. And I think that it's a horrible legacy when you have these entrenched groups. I think that's one of the things Colombia is dealing with the DAS and all the other issues they're facing, and that Mexico is certainly going to deal with in the near future. And on the Colombia question, I think that removing the existential threat to the state is a necessary first step. I think Colombia has had made significant progress, and also in the inability to deal with many of the human rights issues had significant stumbling blocks. But I think at the bottom line, that is getting rid of on the military side, creating the space where you have the possibility for other groups to come in is, this is my reluctant conclusion after watching this process for years, is the fundamental prerequisite for other things to happen. And I would disagree a little bit with Boz on the Colombian military. I think that what made the Colombian military change happen the way it did was in large part the Colombian military had its own vision of what it wanted to do and realized it was about to lose the war, and that there was a significant purge of the military the upper ranks by the lower ranks, saying this is enough, wedded in a very sort of tenuous, but I think ultimately fairly successful ability of the United States to match what the Colombians wanted with what we could give them, instead of trying to tell them what to do, especially in the latter part of the program, the last 3 to 5 years, where you've seen significant Colombian ingenuity on all the major operations that freed the hostages and other things have all been Colombian led, with U.S. support in very targeted and I would say useful ways that we've seen very few other places in the world.
Okay. Let's take some additional questions and comments. This gentleman here on the side, Howard here, go ahead.
Hi, Bob Lakin from the Nixon Center. Several of you mentioned the Mexican presence in Central America, but in Mexico, something like 90% of the deaths are due to intracartel fighting, turf wars. I don't hear any mention of that in Central America. Are the Zetas fighting the Sinaloa cartel there, or are their presence so low that they don't do that? Or what would be the reasons for there not being turf war if there aren't?
Okay, Cindy has stepped out to the bathroom. Who else had their hands up? Why don't we go here and then over here, then to Margaret. Oh, Margaret in the back too. Yeah, sorry, Margaret. Soon, next, Margaret.
My name is Juan Fogelbach. I'm a researcher with the U.S. Immigration Service. I have a question. Something that hasn't come up in this discussion is the role of the resurgence of death squads in the country as a response to gang activity and also as a response to organized crime. I was wondering if you could generally comment on that and the effect that it's having on the faith in citizen security, or in faith in the democratic institutions in these countries, and what the outlook is down the road, given that you bring up the 100 million that you're asking for, but one popular belief is that in comparison to the 1.2 billion going to Mexico, it's actually not very important to provide U.S. support for the institutions down there. So if you could just generally comment on that.
Let's do Sam and then Margaret, and then maybe answer those.
Hi, thank you. Sam Logan with Southern Pulse. I wanted to touch briefly on an important point that I think Juan Carlos made, and that is that the criminal groups have a long-term strategy, whereas a lot of these governments, you look at Lobo, Colom, maybe they're looking more at their immediate solvency and the strategy to maintain the solvency of their own political party. And from our point of view, we look at these groups as economic actors. And I wonder if the market pressures in Mexico and the market pressures for them in Colombia have indeed pushed them to Central America to a point where they're comfortable there. From my perspective, business is good for these guys in Central America. And if we consider just cocaine as one product, and that maybe demand has plateaued in this country, and that the European Union has become an emerging market for cocaine, maybe even Eastern Europe, you think of their other products, black tar heroin, methamphetamines, and then add into that the idea of substitution, where perhaps there's coke production labs in Nicaragua maybe, or Honduras. My question then would be, to what extent 5-10 years down the road does Central America become sort of a back office for drug trafficking? Not necessarily just the United States, but also to Europe.
Let's do Margaret in the back there, and then Cindy can take people.
Thank you, Margaret Daly Hayes. I wanted to challenge perhaps the hypothesis that Chris expressed, but others have followed up on, that citizen security is the foremost goal, and maybe the panel would respond as to whether it's not necessary also to pursue an economic revitalization in these, or maybe not revitalization, but vitalization in these countries in order to provide an alternative economy, alternative incentives for the groups. And then I'd also like to ask how long is the Juan Carlos suggested that we should engage in alternative scenario building. How long is the United States immune from the penetration of this organized crime and a more visible relationship of violence and crime? Some seem to think that the cartels aren't going to allow their folks in the United States to engage in violence because they'd be closed down. Your reaction to that hypothesis would be useful.
Sure. In the back, Howard.
Howard Wiarda from CSIS. I wanted to make a comment which doesn't require a response from the panelists necessarily, but all this sounds so familiar to me: crime and violence and disintegration and fragmentation. It sounds like Central America in the 1980s all over again. And then I look around the room and I see Diana and Mike Jacek and Bob Lakin and Margaret Hayes, all of whom worked on policy issues in the 1980s, as well as myself. So I wonder if we, speaking of new paradigms, might think of Central America as cyclical every 25 or 30 years, rather than the inevitable march of democracy and development, which of course we all favor. I'm just reminded of Jefferson's comment that every country requires a revolution every 25 or 30 years, except that Jefferson got his countries wrong. It's not the United States, it's Central America, where it seems almost on a generational basis that many of these issues of disintegration and fragmentation and breakdown and new elements trying to get into the system somehow reoccur.
Over here.
Thank you. My name is Gianni Colasinisi. I'm an Italian judge posted at the embassy or in Washington. If it's possible, I would like just to make a comment after the consideration of Mr. Garçon regarding the Italian mafia. I recognize we have the brand and we colonize most of the world with this horrible phenomena. But we also have so many receipts to share with people all over the world, because the last history of the last 20 years is a successful history on fighting against mafia in Italy. And for example, you mentioned today the role of the army, that is an experience of 20 years ago that we had, using army without having any active role, without avoiding to withdraw the role of the police, because you have to restore the hope of the people and to trust the people in the law enforcement. If you use the army, you cannot do that. But it's a very old experience. It's a successful experience. But we have to have clear in mind that only with the professionality of the police forces you can afford this kind of horrible phenomena. And let me also make a second consideration. Mr. Ashe spoke about the restore of the of the people, security for citizens. If you are a state that wants really to restore the hope of the people, you cannot propose to the people just one model, that is repression. the support, also the financial support, cannot be just tanks, guns, bullets, and something like that. We had in Italy 15 years ago a project named Security for Development. On one side, you have the state supporting through the police force to restore the legality in a country. And on the other side, to have a program of financial support to support the honest people in the country, people that want to invest, people that want to create new jobs. Only in this way, if you have this rainbow program, you can have a strategy against organized crime. I'm so sorry if I don't have any question, but I would like to share this old and horrible experience I had. Thank you.
Thank you. That comment is very well taken. We're over our time. I'd like to return to our panelists and invite final comments by each person. We'll start with Julie.
To address some of the questions and also as a final comment, I go back to one of the points I made in my presentation, which is the country needs to, for the country to contribute to its own solutions, it needs to fix basic problems like strengthening the political party organizations, and also it has to work on having more long-term plans. This is why there may be an important or a very strong security plan, but nothing will work if the own Guatemalan institutions are not strengthened and the political parties are unable to contribute because they are not strong institutions themselves or not strong organizations. Regarding the army, I would just say that in the case of Guatemala, it's being called in because the police doesn't have enough resources to fight organized crime, but it also doesn't have enough numbers. And the idea is that the army will cover the police while the police gets to the level where it can fight organized crime. The question is whether it will reach that level. Right now, the one long-term plan that the government has is a police reform that will or should last 13 years. But one might have to ask if the next government will support the police reform with resources and political will. So we go back to square one if the army will continue to be a band-aid solution or if it will be used as part of a comprehensive security plan. Thank you.
Margaret, to address your question on citizen security, economics, it's the ultimate chicken-egg question. You can't do economic development without security, and you can't do sustained security without economic development. And you have to be able to do them in parallel. There's a slight argument that security should come first, but barely first, as in security. And a lot of times these countries roll in with security with no economic plan behind it. They'll tell you, yes, we're going to do them 1, 2, but then it's 1 space 2, and that space kills it. Sam, in terms of the long-term view on Central America, 5-10 years midterm view, yes, I do see these organizations moving in a lot of ways and kind of having a base of power. It may not be Honduras, Guatemala. It may not look like it does today, but they will find a spot where the path of least resistance where they feel most comfortable and probably sit there for some time. And I think we have to watch them trying to identify which country that is. Today, if we were to look at it, I think it's these 3 countries, but that wouldn't stop them from moving to another country, perhaps Belize or somewhere else, if that becomes an issue. Death squads, I'm very concerned about vigilante justice. I'm very concerned about landowners deciding to take matters into their own hands if they feel the state is not doing enough. And I feel and you have to be concerned about the state looking away if there are paramilitary or vigilante groups that start to move in and deal with this problem. As occurred in Colombia in the 80s and 90s, it's a rather scary possibility, and we've seen it in Guatemala. You start to see the very beginnings of it in Honduras, and if the state can't strengthen itself, then landowners and the business community will find ways to use private militaries, and that's a really bad route to go, as the Colombia example in the 80s and 90s showed. And in terms of the Mexican intercartel violence, it's not quite the same as Mexico in the fact that in Mexico you can kind of map out where these groups are, and as Julie noted, it's more routes than territory. So they're fighting over specific locations, and a lot of times those battles are more one-off than a sustained sort of confrontation over months and years. You know, they'll go have a shootout for a week, and then one group will move on to another to another. At least that's my view on how I've seen things in Honduras. And so the violence is really terrible in Central America. In some ways, it's worse than Mexico at a nationwide level. But it's not the same sort of territorial control game that you see in Mexico.
I was just going to address the limpieza social issue as well. I think that it's a product of the complete collapse of the state in that area and a product of fear. And I think that what you see is if that cycle builds, as Boz just said, you end up with the autodefensas like you had in Colombia and other groups that came out of a response to the lack of state ability to deal with that. And I think it's a huge and looming problem, because I think the states are becoming less capable, not more capable, and the push toward private justice, and as folks are saying, if you know you're going to be arrested, if you know the guy's going to be arrested and he has a 2% chance of actually going to trial, you'll off him right there. It's just, especially if something's happened to your family or whatever. So I think the pressure for limpieza social is really huge, and I think it's going to be one of the really grinding issues going forward that will further delegitimize the state in many ways, in ways that they can't afford. On Central America, I agree with Boz that in 5 or 10 years, I think what you're going to see, I think that as we've seen historically in Mexico, they don't like a lot of violence around them, and I think if you're looking at levels of violence, the Mexicans moving in a more significant way might actually benefit these countries, and in the sense that they'll knock off a lot of the little fighting, because they don't want their beaches to be shot up. They want to race their horses. They want to do whatever they're going to do, and so they don't like a lot of loose violence out there. So in a sad way, it might might get a brief reprieve, but I do think they're going to move into Central America, not just because of the pressure in Mexico, but because they can. Why not? It's a great place to do business, and the pressure is much less, and the dollarization effect, I think, is also hugely important to them. And I think the last thing is that it really does come down. People ask me all the time, what is the U.S. doing? And I think that's a fair question, but the question also is, what are you doing in your own countries? What are the countries doing for themselves? And the political will issue is huge. I hadn't really thought, as Julie was pointing out, about how these parties disappear so quickly, but now in Salvador, you have this emergence of this huge new party. Comes out of nowhere, has national offices, they estimate it costs about $18 million to do what this party did in about a 3-week period. Where does that money come from?